The quiet corridors of Wynthorpe Hall carried the scent of fading lilies and opened windows, the kind of stillness that settled over a home only when grief lingered in its corners. It was in these rooms that the Duchess had taken her final breaths, and it was here, in the dim hush of her bedchamber, that Alexander Hawthorne, known to the world as the Duke of Wynthorpe, and to a precious few as Xander, made the promise that would shape the rest of his life. He had knelt beside her bed, his large frame bowed so low it made him look like a boy again, not the commanding Duke society whispered about. His mother, pale and fading, had taken his hand with surprising strength. She had always been the one person he let touch him without tension tightening his shoulders. A habit formed after childhood illness had left him overly sensitive to closeness, to being handled, to the overwhelming press of hands and voices. Her touch had always been gentle enough for him to bear. Her voice, quiet, thin to fragile threads, had carried a weight greater than the title he bore. She told him he must marry, that the line must continue, that he must not live out his days alone, hidden away in the corners of the world he preferred. She told him she knew him better than anyone, that he did not crave solitude the way others believed. He only feared the expectations that accompanied society's gaze, the pressure to speak flawlessly, to present himself without the slight, betraying stutter that emerged whenever emotion climbed too high in his chest. And she told him something he never forgot, that tenderness, once found, could heal as surely as time. He had promised her, not because he believed in the possibility of such healing, but because refusing a dying mother, her last request, felt like a sin no duke could redeem. When she passed, a strange quiet settled over him. He became even more deliberate in his solitude, even more sparing in his appearances at balls, musicales, and assemblies. His rare presence at any event turned the host into an instant darling of the ton. Invitations bearing golden seals piled up on silver trays, but he ignored most. Those he did attend, he walked through like a ghost, never fully letting himself participate, never letting anyone too close, never managing more than a polite conversation before the weight of too many eyes, too many expectations, pushed him back toward the shadows. He was a man observed, never understood. Yet, despite his efforts to remain withdrawn, society spun stories around him about the reclusive Duke with the clipped, careful words and the unapproachable air. The ton whispered that he simply preferred his own company. Some insisted he was arrogant. Others thought him cold. None realized that touch, casual and thoughtless in society's world, struck him like lightning, too intense, too immediate. None understood that his silence was not disdain but self-preservation. Still, a promise was a promise. And so the search began. He examined lists of eligible ladies' names, ages, reputations, all laid out like goods in a merchant's ledger. He sought not affection nor companionship. He wanted only someone who might tolerate him enough to help him fulfill his duty. A woman who would accept a quiet marriage, devoid of the intimacy he found so difficult. A lady who would not demand constant presence, or charm, or social brilliance. Someone who would not question why he rarely came near enough to brush her hand. He did not think love belonged anywhere in this arrangement. Love, in his world, was a luxury for other men, those whose hearts did not carry the bruises of childhood loneliness and unspoken fears. He believed himself better suited to practicality, to quiet, to a simple life arranged in respect and distance. Fate, however, had never concerned itself with the plans of dukes. It began the night his favorite mare showed signs of foaling earlier than expected, a restless, anxious pacing in her stall, a wild look in her eyes that even the stable hands struggled to calm. The mare had been a gift from Xander's mother on his 20th birthday, and her nearing delivery stirred emotions he had not anticipated. He spent hours in the stables watching over her, unable to leave, unable to remain distant. The stablemaster eventually suggested bringing someone from the nearby villages, someone known for an extraordinary instinct with animals. No ordinary stable boy or veterinarian, but a baron's daughter. A young woman who preferred barns to ballrooms, whose skill had saved many fine horses from difficult births. Xander raised a brow at that. A baron's daughter? In his stables? At midnight? But the mare was restless again, and his mother's voice lingered in his mind like a whisper of wind. He gave the order, "Let her come." He returned to the mare's stall, bracing himself for the hours ahead. His coat was dusted with hay, his hair touched by the dampness of the warm stable air. He didn't hear the soft footsteps behind him at first, nor the gentle intake of breath from the visitor, whose presence would alter the course of everything he thought he knew about duty, affection, or love. Lucy Ann Whitcomb paused just inside the stable doors, taking in the sight of the reclusive Duke of Wynthorpe, with quiet curiosity, though she did not yet know his identity. Xander felt the shift in the air before he turned. Something subtle, something warm. When he finally looked over his shoulder, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. There she stood, mud-speckled hem, untamed tendrils of hair escaping her bonnet, a worn satchel slung over her arm, and eyes bright, with a serenity he had never encountered in the rigid formality of London's drawing rooms. Her gaze slipped to the mare, then back to him, and without hesitation she stepped forward. Her presence felt impossibly close, though she stood at a respectable distance. It was her warmth, her ease, that unsettled him. She seemed utterly unbothered by titles or rank, completely unaware of the invisible barriers he kept between himself and others. And she spoke, she spoke. Not in clipped, careful tones like the ladies of the ton, but in soft, flowing words that carried no judgment, no awareness of how her nearness might make him tense. She spoke of the mare, of her breathing, her posture, the signs of early labor, the necessity of calm surroundings. Her voice washed over him like warm rain. She filled the silence he feared, but without overwhelming him. It felt strange, impossibly strange, that he did not mind the sound. She didn't know who he was. And for the first time in years, Xander felt something shift inside him, something old and aching loosened, though he could not name it yet. As she moved closer to the mare, steady and competent, Xander remained standing in the half-lit stall, unable to look away from the woman who had walked into his sanctuary without bowing, whispering, or recoiling. Lucy Ann Whitcomb had no idea she had just stepped into the life of a man who believed himself untouchable. The stable lanterns cast a warm, amber glow upon the wooden beams overhead, and dust motes drifted lazily through the still air, as though time itself had slowed to observe the scene unfolding. Xander stood silently near the stall door, his posture rigid, but his gaze fixed upon the young woman now kneeling beside his mare. In all his carefully ordered life, he had rarely witnessed anything so disarming as Lucy Ann Whitcomb at work. She moved with a quiet confidence, unhurried yet precise, as though she were born to tend to creatures who felt too much. Her hands, small, steady, and assured, glided along the mare's belly and flanks with such tenderness that even Xander felt himself easing unconsciously, the tension in his shoulders loosening without his permission. It startled him. He had never relaxed in front of strangers. Lucy Ann, blissfully unaware of the man watching her with an intensity he could not soften, began speaking again, her voice flowing in gentle waves. She explained the mare's condition, the signs of early labor, the importance of the stable's temperature, the need for a calming presence. Xander found himself listening, truly, listening not to the words, but to the cadence. She filled the quiet in a way that soothed rather than suffocated. Her chatter wove into the air like threads of sunlight, softening the edges of the night. She spoke with such unguarded earnestness that she reminded him of the countryside itself, open, honest, peaceful. He realized, with a discomfort he could not hide from himself, that she had not yet asked for his name, nor his title, nor even given the slightest sign that she recognized him. It was not pride that tightened his throat at this fact, it was something more fragile. A strange and unfamiliar gratitude. She did not pause for permission to speak. She simply existed, freely, fully, entirely unshaped by the expectations that weighed upon every woman of the ton. There was a freedom in her he had never known. When the mare shifted, Lucy Ann laid a hand on her neck, murmuring soft reassurances that Xander could barely make out. The mare, usually spirited and anxious with strangers, calmed beneath her touch. It was enough to draw Xander's breath quietly inward. He had seen the finest veterinarians work with less effect. And then, quite without warning, Lucy Ann began to ramble. Not in the aimless way of those who sought attention, but with the unfiltered warmth of someone who simply cared about the world, every part of it, even the animals, others dismissed as creatures without sense. She spoke of her father's farm and the foalings she had tended, of books she had read about breeding and bloodlines, of the curious personalities of horses, which she described with such animation that Xander nearly forgot to steady his breath. She rambled, and she had no idea how intoxicating her unself-consciousness was to a man who had spent his entire life trying to be smaller, quieter, less noticeable. There came a moment when she straightened, brushing stray wisps of hair from her forehead. She did not notice that a mark of hay clung to her cheek. Xander noticed. In fact, he noticed in a way that unsettled him deeply. It was absurd, more than absurd, that a duke could feel captivated by a small piece of hay clinging to the cheek of a baron's daughter. He forced himself to look away. Yet, for all his attempt at quiet control, The mare had a way of drawing Lucy Ann back to her full attention, and with every shift or softening of the animal's posture, Lucy Ann narrated her understanding aloud, her words weaving a story he found himself following without resistance. Time passed, though Xander hardly felt its movement. Stable hands came and went, their steps hushed in deference, but Lucy Ann existed in a world entirely untouched by the presence of rank. She did not bow her head or drop her gaze. She simply did her work. Only once did she inadvertently approach him too closely. She rose from tending the mare and turned, stepping backward, without realizing that Xander stood just inches behind her. Their bodies nearly touched. The sudden heat of her nearness startled him so sharply that he stepped away as though struck by a wave of cold air. His breath tightened, his pulse leapt, and a flash of instinct, a lifetime's worth of discomfort, made his heart thud too loudly in his chest. But she, caught up in her thoughts, did not notice. She kept talking, blissfully unaware of the boundaries she had nearly crossed. He found himself grateful for her ignorance of his reaction. He did not want her to think him rude or strange. He did not want her to see the weakness he had hidden for so long. When the mare finally settled into rest, her breathing steady, Lucy Ann stood once more and exhaled softly. Her face glowed with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had given comfort and received nothing in return but peace. Xander watched her with a stillness that bordered on reverence. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. When she finally collected her satchel and prepared to leave, she paused just a heartbeat before stepping out of the stall. She lifted her eyes to him, and in that moment, Xander felt the ground shift beneath him. She smiled. Not a social smile, not a practiced one, but something gentle, warm, completely unaware of his rank. And then she spoke the first words to him that carried weight, though she could not have known it. She thanked him for allowing her to help the mare. Him. As though he were an ordinary man and not the most intimidating figure in half of England's peerage. He wanted to respond, to say something meaningful, but the familiar tightening in his throat returned. Words snagged. His stutter threatened. Instead, he managed a nod, a small one. She did not notice his struggle. And perhaps that more than anything was what left him standing in that stall long after she had disappeared into the night. For the first time in years, Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Wynthorpe, felt the faintest flicker of something dangerously close to hope. The days that followed, the foaling settled over Wynthorpe Hall with a peculiar softness, as though the very air remembered the presence of the young woman who had breathed life into the dusky stables. Xander found himself thinking of her in quiet moments, never purposefully, yet she appeared in his thoughts with the ease of a passing breeze. He recalled the way she spoke in unbroken streams, her words flowing like a gentle river. He remembered how she touched the mare with a tenderness he had seldom witnessed in people. And he remembered the strange sensation, unnerving, yet not unwelcome, of almost feeling at ease near her. He had intended to forget her. Simply a baron's daughter who had tended a mare, nothing more. But the human heart rarely listens to intention. Wynthorpe Hall was home to a sprawling garden designed by his late mother, rows of rose bushes, winding gravel paths, ancient trees that whispered when the wind passed through them. Xander often sought refuge there. It was one of the few places where the silence felt like a companion rather than a judge. He had retreated there one morning just after sunrise, seeking the comfort of solitude. The garden dew shimmered upon the leaves, and the air was thick with the perfume of early blooms. This was his sanctuary, the one place where the weight of his title slipped a fraction from his shoulders. But fate did not respect sanctuaries. As he rounded a curve near the old stone bench, a figure came into view, a slender silhouette in a pale gown, her hair braided loosely down her back, a worn satchel beside her. Lucy Ann. She was kneeling in the grass, examining a patch of delicate blossoms with the same reverence she had shown the mare. She murmured softly to herself, as though the flowers were willing participants in her rambling. She seemed so at home in the quiet morning that Xander felt momentarily intruding. Though this was his garden, his estate, his world, she should not have been there. And yet he could not bring himself to summon even a whisper of irritation. She must have heard him, for she looked up. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by that same warm, disarming smile that had undone him in the stables. She rose quickly, not out of deference, but excitement, as though greeting an old acquaintance. She began speaking at once. She explained that she had returned to check on the mare, that she had been told he could often be found in the gardens, that she hoped her presence was not unwelcome. Then she began chattering brightly, breathlessly, about the blossoms she had discovered, the scent of the lavender patch, and the curious behavior of a bird nesting near the fountain. Her words spun around him, soft and musical in the morning light. Xander heard his heartbeat too clearly, felt the familiar tightening of his throat as he searched for a reply. Speech had always betrayed him. Emotion made the stutter worse. And he could not deny, it stirred something deep and unsettling within him. He offered a single nod. Perhaps a shade too stiff, perhaps not enough. But Lucy Ann, oblivious to the depth of his struggle, simply continued speaking as though silence were an invitation. She filled the quiet with gentle enthusiasm, unaware of how her presence pressed against the walls he had built around himself. And for reasons he could not name, he did not walk away. It became a pattern. Lucy Ann visited the hall under the guise of tending the mare, though she spent nearly as much time in the gardens. Xander encountered her there more often than coincidence could justify. She seemed always to be perched upon the stone bench, or kneeling beside a bed of herbs, or trailing her fingers along the petals of roses. She always spoke first, and she always spoke as though she believed he needed her words. Perhaps he did. She brought color into the gray places of his life, and he, who had long avoided people because of the way touch and closeness overwhelmed him, found himself drifting closer to her without meaning to. Their distances changed. At first, she stood 3 respectful strides away. Then 2, then 1. There came a moment small, nearly invisible, when she leaned closer to show him the delicate pattern on a flower's petal. Her shoulder brushed his arm, feather-light, yet impossibly intimate. Xander went utterly still, every muscle pulled taut. His breath caught, not in discomfort, but in an unfamiliar sensation that tightened low in his chest. She did not notice. She simply continued speaking, her voice a gentle balm. But Xander noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed how her presence softened the ache he carried, how she made silence feel less like suffocation, how her rambling soothed the very places where loneliness used to sting. He found himself waiting for her visits. He found himself stepping into the gardens earlier than usual, hoping, though he refused to admit it, that she might appear. He found himself listening for her footfalls. And when she finally arrived each day, carrying the warm scent of hay and lavender, he felt something shift inside him, something he had not felt since childhood, perhaps not ever. One afternoon, after she had completed her usual whirlwind of chatter, Lucy Ann rose from the stone bench and brushed her skirts. Her fingers grazed a stray leaf tangled at her hem. She sighed, the breath soft and wistful. She mentioned almost to herself that she felt more at peace in his gardens than anywhere else, that the world often overwhelmed her, that the ton felt too loud, too demanding, that she much preferred animals and flowers to the chaos of society. Xander watched her as she spoke, and for the first time he saw not merely a baron's daughter but a woman who, like him, hid from the world in small ways, a woman who sought quiet because it offered safety. He felt the urge sudden and powerful to tell her she could come whenever she wished. The words formed. They lodged in his throat. His chest tightened. His voice fractured before it escaped. So instead, he simply stepped closer. Close enough that she paused, looked up, and blinked in quiet surprise. Close enough that a single breath could have bridged the distance. He did not touch her, not yet, but the intention hovered in the air between them, warm and trembling. Lucy Ann did not retreat. She smiled, soft and unguarded. And for a moment, the Duke of Wynthorpe wondered what it might feel like to let someone all the way in. Their next encounter in the gardens would change everything. But neither of them knew it yet. The evening air had cooled, leaving the garden bathed in twilight. Xander remained where he had stepped close to Lucy Ann, his chest tight, his thoughts tangled. He had not moved, had not spoken, had only let the space between them shrink, and yet that small act had felt like a confession. He had no words for what he felt. He knew only that her presence was a balm he could not name, a pull he could not resist. Her smile, soft and unguarded, lingered in his mind long after she had left the garden, her skirts brushing the cobblestones, her voice echoing faintly like wind through the hedges. He paced his study later that night, the quiet of Wynthorpe Hall pressing in around him. Normally, he would have sought solace in books, in ledgers, in the meticulous order of his affairs, but tonight, even the rigid lines of ink and paper could not absorb the swirl of emotions Lucy Ann had stirred. He realized something both exhilarating and terrifying. He wanted to speak to her, to hear her thoughts, to invite her closer, but the words lodged in his throat. His stutter, his long-practiced distance, made even the smallest attempt feel monumental. And yet, he could not let this moment pass unacknowledged. Morning found him restless, pacing the quiet halls before dawn. The house was still, the servants not yet stirring, and the first light was just brushing the rooftops. His mind circled the memory of her laughter, the way she had seemed entirely at ease in the garden, unguarded. He longed to tell her she was welcome, not merely tolerated, but truly wanted. To let her know she had a place in his carefully ordered, solitary world. By the time the sun filtered through Wynthorpe Manor the next morning, Xander had convinced himself. He would speak. He would step forward, perhaps not perfectly, perhaps haltingly, but with sincerity. And as he reached the top of the staircase, preparing to greet Lucy-Anne, he felt the first tremors of courage stir in his chest. The day had begun, and with it, the next chapter of their fragile, careful, and slowly deepening connection. The evening air was cooling, soft shadows stretching across the garden. Xander lingered just a few paces behind Lucy-Anne, his chest tight, mind tangled in emotions he could neither name nor control. She had rambled as she always did, unaware of the effect her words, her laughter, even the tilt of her head had on him. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to speak freely, to tell her that her presence had become a light in his otherwise muted world. But then reality, his fears, his habits, his private walls crept back in. The Duke of Wynthorpe had spent years avoiding contact, avoiding closeness. Her forwardness, her care, and the gentle warmth she radiated were dangerous to him in a way no physical threat ever had been. He knew his stutter and hypersensitivity to public exposure made him an unpredictable host, and tonight, even the garden's privacy felt precarious, like the world could intrude at any moment. So he did what he had always done when faced with too much. He stepped back. Not entirely, but enough. Not now, his mind whispered. Too soon. Lucy-Anne, he finally muttered, words rough, broken. But it wasn't a greeting. It was a hesitation, a warning to himself more than to her. She paused mid-step, looking back at him with an inquisitive tilt of her head. Yes? She asked softly, not noticing the tension coiling in him like a spring. He stopped. Couldn't finish. The urge to speak was there, fierce, but the thought of opening himself fully terrified him. I think it would be best if you went. Her brow furrowed. I'm not doing anything wrong, am I? No, not wrong, he stammered, his voice catching. Just too much. For tonight. She blinked, confusion knitting her delicate features. Too much? Yes. He shook his head, frustrated. I cannot explain. Just, please. He gestured vaguely toward the path back to her carriage. Go. Rest. Tomorrow. He trailed off, unable to form the promise he longed to give. Tomorrow, I will be better. Tomorrow, I will speak. So she left, and he watched her retreating figure, chest tightening, heart pounding. That night, in the vast silence of his estate, he replayed every detail, every smile, every laugh, every stray lock of her hair falling across her face as she examined the foal. His heart ached with the regret of sending her away, but he could not reconcile his own fears with the desire she awakened in him. He tried to read, he tried to work. Nothing focused his mind. Every shadow in the hall, every creak of the floorboards seemed to whisper her name. Sleep eluded him. The walls of his room felt closer than usual, oppressive, almost suffocating. By morning, Xander had made a decision. He could no longer allow his fear to dictate their connection. She deserved an explanation. She deserved honesty. And, above all, she deserved an apology. He found her in the stall, still tending to the foal per request. Gloves tugged lightly, letters on a tray in the hands of a rushing footman. Her attention was elsewhere, yet the moment she looked up, their eyes met, and he felt the pull, sharp and undeniable. Miss Harrow, he said softly, descending the stairs with deliberate care, each step measured, as though pacing could steady his racing heart. I owe you an apology. Lucy-Anne tilted her head, curiosity alight in her gaze. For what, Your Grace? For sending you away last night, he murmured, voice tight but sincere. I spoke poorly. His words faltered. I did not mean to drive you from the gardens. You didn't drive me away, she replied gently. You walked out, he reminded her, tone catching. And I asked you to. Her smile, patient and knowing, was a balm. And you let me, and I left only because I wished to honor your request. He blinked, stunned by her grace. No one had ever responded to him like that, calm, unshaken, accepting of the fractured pieces of him. I asked you to walk out, he murmured under his breath, voice roughened with regret. Because if I had stopped you, he shook his head, the words lost in the weight of his own vulnerability. Lucy Ann stepped closer, an inch, a gesture so small yet seismic to him. His chest tightened. Every instinct screamed retreat, but he remained, rooted, watching her approach with a mixture of terror and longing. "Does proximity trouble you, my lord?" she asked softly, voice gentle, patient. He swallowed, voice low. "It is not proximity. It is what it does." "And what does it do?" "Things," he said finally, the word heavy and trembling. "Things you should not be able to do to me." Her heart gave a dangerous flutter. Before she could reply, a door opened. Lord Hawthorne stepped back, instantly, too quickly, almost violently, as if scorched. The neutral mask slid over his face in a heartbeat. Lady Brixton swept in, all bustle and purpose, not noticing the crackle of tension she had interrupted. "Lord Hawthorne," she said briskly, "your presence is required in the study. Matters regarding the estate accounts." He nodded, distant again. "I will attend shortly." Lady Brixton hurried off. Lucy Ann looked at him, disappointment flickering in her chest at how fast he had retreated behind his emotional armor. But then, very quietly, he reached toward her. Not to take her hand, not to hold her arm, just the faintest touch, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve. Barely anything. But for him, it was everything. "Do not leave. Not today," he murmured. "I know I have no right to ask, but stay." Her breath softened. "I'll stay." His eyes closed for a brief second, as if relief was a physical thing he could feel. He stepped away again, struggling to regain his composure. "Thank you," he said, voice roughened in a way she hadn't heard before. "I will return." Lucy Ann watched him walk down the hall, shoulders straight, pace controlled, but with an unmistakable tremor in his hands. He was unraveling. And she was becoming the only person he allowed near enough to see it. Lucy Ann wandered the East Gardens for nearly an hour, letting the crisp morning air cool her nerves. But no matter how many trimmed paths she followed, her thoughts kept circling back to the Duke. Alexander. Go. She still remembered the shock she'd felt weeks ago when she first learned he was the Duke, her quiet, sharp-eyed stranger from the Foaling Barn. The discovery hadn't come dramatically. She had overheard his title mentioned in passing by a pair of housemaids, and only then had all the little clues fallen neatly into place. Even now, the memory warmed and unsettled her in equal measure. She had spoken to him far too freely in those early days, unaware of his rank, yet he had never corrected her. Never pulled away from her chatter, never used his title to place distance between them. And that, perhaps more than anything, was why he lingered in her thoughts long after he tried to push her away. A man who avoided touch as though it burned him, yet had reached for her sleeve as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world. She found herself lingering near the manor doors, telling herself she was only enjoying the air. She knew it wasn't true. He appeared sooner than she expected. The study door opened, and the Duke of Hawthorne stepped out alongside his steward. But the moment his eyes found her standing in a beam of soft sunlight, his whole posture shifted, barely perceptible, but real. A pull, a subtle, involuntary drift toward her. The steward bowed and departed, leaving Xander alone with her in the cool morning light. "You remained," he said, his voice quieter than usual, relief threading through the words. "You asked me to," she whispered. "I wish to honor it." Xander looked at her as though the concept of someone staying for him was a delicate, foreign thing. "I do not often ask for what I want," he said slowly. "Desire is not safe for men like me." "Men like you?" she asked. His gaze drifted toward the distant treetops. Men who were taught that wanting anything leads only to disappointment or disaster. It was a crack in his armor, small but honest. "Is that why you avoid people?" she asked gently. "Or why you avoid touch?" He stiffened, then surprised them both by answering. "I avoid touch," he murmured, "because I feel too much of it, more than I should. A breath. And it is overwhelming." Before she could speak, a carriage rumbled up the drive, the hawthorn crest gleaming in the sun. His jaw tightened. Of all days. A tall, elegant woman stepped down, draped in a rich plum gown, her smile polished into perfection. "Alexander," she purred, "you did not write back." Again. Lucy Ann froze. Who was she? The Duke bowed, stiff and formal. "Lady Rosamond." She swept forward with practiced grace. "I was passing through the county and thought to call on an old friend." His eyes flicked instinctively, unmistakably to Lucy Ann. Lady Rosamond noticed immediately. "And who?" she asked, her gaze sliding to Lucy Ann. "Is this young lady?" Lucy Ann curtsied. Lucienne Harrow, my lady. Rosamond's eyes lingered a shade too long. Harrow? The Baron's daughter? How quaint. The Duke stepped slightly in front of Lucienne, barely noticeable unless one was watching him closely. A subtle shield. Rosamond, he said firmly, Wynthorpe has a guest. I must ask that you keep your visit brief. A guest? She echoed. And a charming one. Lucienne held her gaze, refusing to shrink. You honor me, Lady Rosamond. Rosamond's smile thinned. Do I? How delightful. When she swept inside, leaving violet perfume in her wake, the Duke exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I apologize, he said softly. Rosamond and I have history. The sort that troubles you? Lucienne asked. The sort, he answered, voice strained, that refuses to remain in the past. For the first time, Lucienne saw genuine unease in him. Not anger, not aloofness, something far more vulnerable. She stepped closer, close enough that her presence steadied him. He did not step away. Your Grace, she whispered, I am not frightened of any history you carry. His breath caught. His eyes met hers, raw and hopeful. You should be, he said, barely more than a whisper. Because I am. For the rest of the day, Wynthorpe felt different, quieter, tighter, as though the presence of Lady Rosamond had drawn invisible lines through the corridors, lines that Lucienne could walk near but not cross without consequence. She sensed that her appearance at Xander's side that morning had unsettled the elegant intruder more than Rosamond wanted to admit. But she also sensed that the woman would not sit idly by and allow her position, whatever it once had been, to be threatened. Lucienne spent much of the afternoon tending the Duke's mare again, deliberately choosing work that kept her outdoors, away from the charged atmosphere inside the manor. Animals did not posture. They did not hide their feelings behind velvet smiles. They did not pretend not to care when they clearly did. Near sunset, the stablemaster approached, tipping his hat. His Grace has asked for you, he said gently. He waits in the West Gardens. Her heart tightened. Just his title, His Grace, was enough to quicken her pulse. She made her way through the long corridors, passing tall windows washed gold with the last light of day. When she reached the West Gardens, she found Xander standing among the tall hedges, the dying sun painting the edges of his hair like bronze. He turned when he heard her step, and something inside him eased just slightly. Enough to be noticeable. You came, he murmured. You asked, she said simply. There was a silence then, comfortable, warm, and strangely intimate. It felt like stepping out of a storm into a quiet room where neither needed to pretend. He motioned for her to walk with him, though he kept a respectful distance. They wandered between rose bushes heavy with scent, neither speaking for a long while. Xander often avoided prolonged conversation, but with Lucienne, he sometimes seemed content to let her fill the space. Today, however, she kept silent. She sensed he needed it. At length, he spoke. Rosamond did not come only to visit. Lucienne waited. She came to remind me of an agreement, he continued. One my mother once encouraged. A faint tremor entered his voice, the kind that hinted at things he rarely allowed himself to feel. She believed Rosamond a suitable match. Lucienne's steps faltered. A match. A marriage. The idea struck her like a blow she hadn't prepared for. She tried to steady her breath. Does Lady Rosamond still expect such a thing? Xander's jaw tightened, the faintest hint of a stutter brushing his words. She expects many things. He stopped walking then, turning to face her fully. His eyes held something conflicted tension coiled beneath gentleness. I told her, he said slowly, that matters of marriage are no longer anyone's decision but my own. Lucienne looked at him, searching his expression. And what do you wish, Your Grace? His throat worked. He did not step back. He did not hide. He simply stood, the evening light softening his usually guarded features. What I wish, he said, voice low, is far less simple. Her breath caught. The air felt different, charged, fragile, trembling with every unspoken word. He reached out. A hesitant gesture. A hand lifted as though drawn toward her, then stilled inches from her arm. It was not quite a touch, but almost enough to send warmth rushing through her. He let his hand fall, as though frustrated with himself or frightened by how badly he had wanted to close the distance. I struggle, he confessed softly, even with the smallest contact. A shoulder brushing mine, a hand on my sleeve. It is all too much, too loud, as though my nerves are made of glass. Lucienne stepped forward. Not enough to frighten him, just enough that their breaths mingled faintly in the cooling air. You are not broken, she whispered. You are simply unshielded. It is a kind of strength, even if you do not see it. Xander's breath hitched. I do not fear touch itself, he said, almost to himself. I fear the wrong touch, the kind that makes me retreat, the kind that feels like theft rather than comfort. And mine? She asked softly. The faintest smile pulled at his lips, honest, weary, disarmed. Yours, he whispered, does not feel like something stolen. It feels like something offered. Something inside her fluttered hard. He looked away, as though overwhelmed by the admission. And that, he added quietly, terrifies me more. She lifted her hand, a gesture slow enough that he could refuse it. She didn't try to take his hand or touch his face. Instead, she placed her fingers lightly against the sleeve of his coat, not even pressing, just resting there, like the brush of a breeze. He froze, not in panic, in awe. His breath deepened. His shoulders loosened. The tension in him softened under her touch, as though he had been waiting aching for this simple moment. Lucy-Anne, he murmured. Her name on his lips sounded reverent. If I let myself. He swallowed. If I allowed the things I want, I fear I would want them all. She felt warmth unfurl in her chest. Perhaps wanting is not a sin, Your Grace. He looked at her as though she had handed him a new truth he did not know how to hold. Their stillness deepened, fragile and exquisitely charged. He leaned in, not enough to touch, but enough that she felt the promise of something more. The faintest brush of his breath warmed the side of her neck. For a moment, it seemed he might kiss her. But then, footsteps. Measured, purposeful, drawing closer. Lady Rosamond. Her silhouette appeared at the garden entrance, framed by the last light of dusk. Alexander, she called, her tone too bright to be innocent. I could not find you anywhere. Xander stiffened, stepping back an inch, not out of rejection, but instinct. Lucy-Anne withdrew her hand. Rosamond's gaze flicked between them, reading far more than either intended to reveal. Well, she said, voice smooth as poured wine, it seems I interrupted something. The Duke's face hardened, and for the first time, he did not look away. He stepped to Lucy-Anne's side, not shielding her, not claiming her, but aligning himself with her. A statement, quiet, unmistakable. Rosamond, he said calmly, we will speak later. Lady Rosamond's smile did not falter, but her eyes sharpened to glass. Of course, she said softly, later. She turned and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. When she was gone, Lucy-Anne looked at Xander with a question she didn't voice. He answered it anyway. His voice quiet. True. I am not hers, he said. I have not been for a very long time. Lucy-Anne felt something warm blossom in her chest. And what of me? She whispered. Xander looked at her as though the question alone undid him. That, he said, is precisely what I must discover before it is too late. The dawn broke over Wynthorpe Hall like a promise. Mist clung to the hedges and lawns, softening the edges of the grand estate, as though the world itself had taken a deep, quiet breath before the day's trials began. Lucy-Anne awoke early, restless. Her thoughts circled endlessly around the Duke. Every stolen moment in the gardens, every brush of his presence, even the faintest, had left her heart racing and her mind unusually tender to his subtle, careful ways. She dressed quickly, tugging a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way toward the Duke's residence. She was a free child, thankfully. Her parents have their hands full with her siblings and their rapidly growing family. At the stables, the mare, though still weak, had settled peacefully. The foal nestled beside her, and for a moment, Lucy-Anne allowed herself to breathe. But she knew Xander would be there soon. She could almost sense the rhythm of his mornings, a solitary walk through the gardens, a quiet inspection of his grounds, a careful avoidance of anyone who might demand too much of him. But today would be different. She spotted him near the far hedge, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the sunlit garden. His posture was rigid, yet something in his stance, the way he allowed the early light to touch his features, made him seem less of a duke and more of the man she had glimpsed in the stables, tender and flawed, so achingly real that she wanted to reach out and hold him close. He saw her first, and his chest tightened at the sight. The instinct to retreat rose in him, but he did not move. He allowed her presence to approach, slow and unassuming, as if testing the air between them. Good morning, Your Grace, she said softly. Lucy-Anne, he breathed, voice low and roughened by early tension. I hoped I would find you here. Their steps toward one another were measured, deliberate. Each inch closed carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. and as they met near the central fountain, surrounded by blooming roses and dewy grass, something shifted, an imperceptible but undeniable surrender of caution. Xander's hand lifted again, this time resting lightly on her elbow. Not grasping, not demanding, just a tether. And yet the warmth that radiated from that simple touch made her stomach flutter. It made him feel alive, unshielded, terribly, dangerously alive. "You do not need to hide from me," she said quietly. "Not here, not with me." His throat worked. His stutter threatened to catch him, but he forced the words out. I do not hide from you. Lucy Ann the First, I cannot hide from you." Her pulse leapt. He had never said anything so openly, so unguarded. The name on his lips, her name, felt like a confession, a promise, a declaration, all at once. Before she could respond, the distant carriage wheels rattled on gravel. Xander stiffened but did not retreat. He straightened, placing himself slightly in front of her, not to shield her, but to stand as her equal, a silent vow of protection and defiance. Lady Rosamond had arrived again, no doubt hoping to remind him of her presence, to claim some shadow of the connection they once had. But Xander's eyes never left Lucy Ann. "You are here," he said softly. "I want you to be here. No one will convince me otherwise." Her chest swelled with warmth. "Then I will stay, Your Grace, if you truly wish it." The Duke's lips curved into the faintest, most tender smile, a break in the walls he had built for decades. His hand reached again, this time tracing the back of her fingers, the movement light, intimate, deliberate, the simplest touch, yet it carried more weight than any word could. Lucy Ann's breath hitched. "Alexander?" He inhaled, leaning closer, not quite daring to bridge the final distance. "Lucy Ann, I do not know how to express what it is you do to me. How it is," he stopped, his throat tight, his chest rising and falling. "How it makes me feel. I am not made for this." "Made for what?" she asked softly, her eyes shining. "Made for letting someone in, letting them see everything." His hand brushed lightly against hers again, closer than before, a whisper of intimacy that left him trembling. You are the only one I allow, the only one I ever will." Her lips parted slightly, and her heart pounded. "Then you do not have to be afraid." And in that quiet, golden morning, the first kiss came not hurried, not desperate, but deliberate, gentle, a promise, a beginning. Xander's hand cupped the side of her face ever so lightly, a reverent touch, as if he feared breaking the fragile trust he had built. Lucy Ann leaned into him, responding not with impatience, but with quiet certainty, letting him know he was safe with her, that he could surrender piece by piece without losing himself. The kiss lingered only briefly, but it was enough. Enough to unearth feelings that had lain buried, enough to ignite desires that had never dared surface, enough to begin dismantling the fortress around his heart. When they parted, the garden seemed different, brighter, the scent of roses more vivid, the sun's rays warmer. "You are mine, Lucy Ann," he whispered, almost to himself, yet loud enough that she felt it reverberate deep inside. "And you are mine," she replied, her voice steady, confident, gentle. The Duke of Wynthorpe had faced the ton, the expectations, the world itself, and found that he could face it all without fear. Because she had chosen him, and he had chosen her. The first threads of love had been woven, delicate, fragile, yet unbreakable. The days that followed the garden kiss settled into a rhythm both delicate and intoxicating. Wynthorpe Hall seemed to have shifted, its walls and corridors steeped in a quiet electricity that only Lucy Ann and Duke Alexander, or Xander as he allowed himself to be in her presence, could feel. The Duke, who had once avoided the world so thoroughly that even brief social visits exhausted him, now found himself seeking moments near her, not for appearances, not for duty, but simply because she existed, and her presence calmed the storm of his thoughts like no medicine ever could. Their mornings were spent in the gardens or among the stables, tending to animals, inspecting new blooms, or simply walking together in companionable silence. Xander had become almost painfully conscious of every inch of proximity he allowed, every brush of his hand against hers, every time his arm lingered near hers. Physical touch, once terrifying, had become a carefully measured bridge between his heart and hers. And she, blissfully unaware of how much patience it required him, rambled on endlessly, her laughter spilling into the air and seeping into his defenses. It began with small gestures, a hand brushing hers ever so lightly as she reached for a flower, a coat draped over her shoulders when she paused too long near the fountain in the chill morning air. A soft squeeze of her fingers when she tripped on a loose cobblestone in the garden path brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her pulse quicken. Lucy Ann, for her part, had begun to notice the subtleties, the quiet ways in which he showed care without words. And she responded in kind, not with hesitation, but with the same openness that had first drawn him in. Her presence was a balm to his anxieties, a quiet anchor that made even his most daunting insecurities manageable. One afternoon, the sun low and gold across the Wynthorpe lawns, Xander finally allowed himself a small indulgence he had not dared before. Lucy Ann was kneeling near a young foal, whispering encouragement as it struggled to its legs. Xander approached quietly, not to startle her, and as he knelt behind her, he placed his hands gently on her shoulders. Not a firm grasp, not commanding, just a presence, grounding, steady, intimate. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned back ever so slightly, resting against him in a gesture that spoke of trust, of acceptance, of love that had begun quietly, but deeply. "Alexander," she murmured, her voice a breath against his ear. "Lucy Ann," he replied softly, leaning his chin just over her shoulder, careful not to overwhelm her. I cannot tell you how much you've changed me." She tilted her head slightly, listening to the vulnerability he let slip, so rare it made her chest ache. "You've healed me," he said, voice hushed. "Not completely, not instantly, but each day I find it easier to be near you, easier to trust that your presence is safe, that your touch is not a threat." Lucy Ann's hand reached up, brushing along his fingers, curling gently into his palm. Xander's breath hitched the intimacy of it, made his heart pound, his chest swell. He had avoided contact for years, yet here, with her, it felt right, essential, inevitable. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "we shall heal each other in time." A quiet laugh escaped him, a sound so rare and unguarded. He leaned down, brushing a faint kiss along the nape of her neck, feather-light and reverent. Lucy Ann shivered, the tiniest sigh escaping her lips, and in that small motion, Xander felt a surge of protective, fierce affection, unlike anything he had ever known. From that day forward, their connection deepened with subtle, deliberate gestures. A hand held in the garden while they watched the sunset, fingers twining slowly, deliberately, a gentle hug from behind as she admired the foals, her head resting briefly against his chest. Neck kisses pressed softly when she bent to inspect a rose, delicate but brimming with meaning. And yet, each advance remained slow, careful, chosen with intent, never rushed, never forced, never out of obligation. Every touch, every brush of his hand against hers was an intimate act, a wordless testament to the trust he was willing to place in her, the vulnerability he had never offered anyone else. Lucy Ann, bold in her kindness, began to speak more freely about her thoughts, her feelings, her whims. She chattered endlessly, rambled without pause, and Xander discovered he had come to love not only her touch, but her voice, her words, her very being. Each syllable, each laugh, each excited story about an animal or a flower felt like a tether drawing him closer, breaking down walls he had carefully built over a lifetime. The ton, with all its expectations and pressures, seemed to recede in importance. Invitations to balls, whispers of society matrons, all faded to gray noise when compared to the quiet intimacy of her presence. She became the only person he allowed near physically and emotionally. One evening, as the sky bled shades of rose and gold, Xander took her hand in both of his thumb tracing the back of her knuckles slowly, reverently. "Lucy Ann," he whispered, voice catching, "I have never wanted anyone as I want you. Never in all my years have I longed for another soul as I long for yours." Her eyes glistened, catching the last light of day. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead against his. "Then do not hold back, Alexander. I am here. I am yours, if you will let me be." He hesitated for only a heartbeat, then bent, capturing her lips in a kiss that was no longer tentative, but filled with all the careful passion he had held back. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, trust, desire, and devotion. It left them both breathless, suspended in a moment that belonged entirely to them. From that day forward, nothing could diminish the quiet certainty of their love. Their romance had blossomed into something real, tender, and true. Xander, the Duke who once feared touch and intimacy, had allowed himself to surrender body and soul to Lucy Ann, the kind-hearted Baron's daughter, who had healed him with her presence, her voice, and her love. Society's expectations could wait. Titles and duties were secondary. For the first time, Duke Alexander Hawthorne, Xander, lived for the love he shared with Lucy Ann, fully, completely, irrevocably. The moon hung low over Wynthorpe's east gardens, silvering the hedges and setting a quiet glow upon the gravel paths. The season's final ball continued in full brilliance inside the house, but the moment Xander saw Lucy Ann slip onto the terrace for a breath of air, the decision struck him cleanly, finally, unmistakably. He followed her out into the gardens, where lanterns flickered like soft constellations among the rose trellises. She walked ahead, fingertips brushing the petals, as though greeting old friends. When she turned, she startled slightly, then smiled soft, knowing, welcoming. "Your Grace," she said, dipping a small curtsy. He disliked the title on her lips. Tonight, more than ever, he wished she would simply say his name. "Lucy Ann," he murmured, stepping closer, each footfall deliberate. He stopped only when they stood beneath the arching branches of an ancient oak, its leaves whispering above them, like keepers of secrets. She looked up at him, cheeks faintly flushed, eyes bright with that unguarded warmth that had undone him from the first moment. "You escaped your own ball?" "I had reason," he said quietly. A breeze stirred a lock of her hair. His fingers twitched. He longed to touch it, tuck it behind her ear, but the moment was too fragile, too sacred to rush. He drew a breath that trembled ever so slightly. "There is something I must ask you, and I cannot, will not say it before 200 curious eyes." Her lips parted, surprise blooming across her face. Xander reached for her hand, not boldly, not claiming it. He simply offered his palm, open, waiting. She placed hers into it with a trust that tightened his throat. "Lucy Ann Harrow," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a vow. "You have brought life into the quiet corners of my world. You eased what I once believed unchangeable. You made room for hope where I had none." Her breath hitched, but she said nothing, letting him speak, letting him be brave. "I cannot promise perfection," he continued softly. "I cannot promise I will always be at ease in crowds, or with touch, or with the expectations that follow my name." He lifted her hand slightly, brushing his thumb over her knuckles, a rare, deliberate caress. "But I can promise that my heart is wholly yours, if you will have me." Her eyes shone. "Alexander," she whispered, the first time she had spoken his full name without hesitation. "You need not be perfect to be loved." He exhaled shakily. "Then you would allow me the honor of asking your father for your hand?" A gentle laugh escaped her, breathless and disbelieving. "Yes," she said, soft as the night air. "Yes, I want that very much." He bowed his head, relief sweeping through him like a quiet tide. And, breaking a rule he had clung to all his life, he leaned forward, not to kiss her lips, but to touch his forehead to hers, a gesture far more intimate than any embrace. She closed her eyes. They stood that way, two silhouettes beneath the ancient oak, sealed together by a promise spoken without fanfare, without audience, just truth. The following afternoon, Xander called upon Harrow Manor. The Baron nearly dropped his teacup when informed the Duke of Wynthorpe awaited him in the drawing room. "Good heavens," Baron Harrow muttered, attempting to flatten his unruly hair. "I haven't been summoned by a duke since your aunt's scandal with the French." "Do not start," the Baroness warned, smoothing her skirts. "And mind your posture. You look like a startled pheasant." He frowned. "I am a startled pheasant." Xander rose as they entered, offering an impeccably respectful bow. The Baroness blinked twice. The Baron looked faintly ill. "Your Grace," Baron Harrow breathed, "to what do we owe?" "I have come," Xander said, "to ask permission to court your daughter with the intention of marriage." If the Baron had looked ill before, he now looked half dead. "Lucy Ann?" he squeaked. "Our Lucy Ann?" The Baroness placed a hand to her chest. "My wild, book-burying, tree-climbing child?" "She climbed only one tree," the Baron muttered defensively. "And you encouraged her." "It was a sturdy tree." Xander stood perfectly still, fighting a smile. The Baroness turned back to him with a whisper of apology. "Forgive us, Your Grace. This is unexpected. Our daughter has always been—" "Uninterested in society?" Xander offered gently. "Precisely," the Baroness sighed. "And wildly particular," the Baron added. "In her own world?" the Baroness finished, shaking her head fondly. Xander allowed a rare, warm expression to soften his features. "It is that very world I have come to cherish." Silence fell. Then the Baron's eyes misted. The Baroness pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "Well," the Baroness said, voice wobbling, "if she says yes, then—" "She has," Xander said softly. The Baron collapsed into his chair with a heartfelt groan. Dear heavens, she is to be a duchess. And she will be impossible to manage now, the Baroness said lightly. She has always been impossible to manage. That is because you never disciplined her. I disciplined her once. She was 5, and it lasted 7 minutes. Xander cleared his throat politely. Both parents snapped to attention. The Baron straightened. Your Grace, you have our blessing. The Baroness nodded firmly, with gratitude. Xander bowed deeply, the bow of a man who understood the enormity of their trust. Years later, the estate of Wynthorpe Hall was quiet in the early morning light, the gardens glistening with dew, and the scent of roses drifting through the air. The grand halls had once felt empty and formal, but now they were alive with laughter, small footsteps, and the warmth of a family. Duke Alexander Hawthorne moved through the nursery with an ease that would have astonished anyone who knew the reserved, guarded man he had once been. Twin daughters, bright-eyed and full of mischief, clung to his hands and twirled in circles around him, their giggles echoing off the walls. Papa, catch us! One of them squealed, her golden curls bouncing with every step. Xander lowered himself to their level, his lips curving into a rare, unguarded smile. I shall catch you, he said, his voice warm and filled with playful authority. But only if you promise not to tumble over my boots this time. Lucy Ann watched from the doorway, her heart swelling at the sight. Little Alex rested on her hip, his dark curls tucked beneath her chin, one small fist clutching at the ribbon of her gown. He was barely 2 years old, soft-cheeked and sleepy-eyed from his morning nap, and he clung to her with the easy trust of a child who knew nothing but love. Her husband, once so fearful of touch, so careful to guard his emotions, was now the center of his daughter's universe, patient and gentle, his every gesture full of love. The children adored him, not merely because he was their father, but because he had learned to love fully, without fear, just as he had learned to love her. The girls squealed again, running to him. Xander swept them both into his arms, one in each, lifting them high so their laughter rang even louder. His hands were steady, sure, full of a tenderness that had once been unimaginable. Lucy Ann stepped closer, adjusting toddler Alex on her hip before placing a gentle hand on her husband's shoulder. You've become quite the favorite, I see, she said softly, her eyes glimmering with affection. He lowered the girls, letting them twirl away, and turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His gaze drifted briefly to the small boy in her arms, and a quiet warmth softened his features. Only because I have the best teacher, he murmured. You taught me how to love, Lucy Ann. You taught me how to let someone in, and now, he glanced toward the girls, laughing nearby, then to the sun who blinked sleepily up at him. This is all of it made real. She smiled, shifting Alex as he nestled closer, and stepped into her husband's embrace, resting her head against his chest. And we did it together, she whispered. Xander wrapped his arms around her, careful of the child between them, yet holding her with the same steady devotion he reserved for their most private moments. Their love, patient and slow, had become the foundation of their life, enduring, intimate, full of quiet steadiness. A simple touch, a shared smile, a whispered word, each held more meaning than any grand gesture ever could. The twins ran back to them, tugging at their father's hands. Papa, tell us the story again. Xander laughed, sweeping them up once more, his heart full beyond measure. Very well, he said, voice deep and melodic. But only if you promise to sit still this time. Lucy Ann leaned against him, Alex now awake enough to watch his sisters with wide-eyed fascination, his tiny hand gripping his father's coat as Xander pressed a kiss to the boy's forehead. She watched the man she had once discovered hiding from the world now embrace it, fully embrace her. Their daughters, their son with a joy so complete it left no room for his former shadows. In that quiet, golden morning at Wynthorpe Hall, with laughter echoing through the corridors and the scent of roses drifting through the open windows, Duke Alexander Hawthorne finally knew a love not merely endured, but savored, a love that healed him, completed him, and deepened each day. And Lucy Ann, his partner in patience, the bearer of his hopes and the mother of his children, knew that theirs was a life quietly rich, deeply cherished, and full of a future bright enough to hold every gentle touch, every whispered vow, and every tender kiss that had begun in a quiet garden long ago. The Duke drew his daughters close, placed a reverent kiss upon his wife's temple, and brushed a thumb over his son's small hand. I am home, he whispered, scarcely louder than a breath. I am whole, and I am yours. Lucy Ann smiled, her fingers entwining with his. Always, Alexander, always yours. And in that moment, The walls of the past, the solitude, the fear finally fell away. Thanks for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories.